In this video, you're going to initialize Git in the web server folder. Once our project is under version control, we'll be able to track changes to all of our application files. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, when we want to use Git, we have to explicitly initialize it in the project where we're trying to use it. For us, that means we need to run a command from the web server folder. Now, it's important that we run this command from the web server folder and not from a nested directory like the public folder or from a parent directory like node course. The command we run needs to be from the root project folder, which is web server. So right here in the web server directory, we are going to use the git init command. Let's run the command and initialize Git in our project. When we do that, quite a few different things are going to happen. Let's go ahead and start with the output we're getting in the terminal down below. Right here, we got the following message: initialized empty Git repository in, followed by a path to our project folder, to the web server directory where we ran the command from. From there, Git has created a new folder, .git. This is where Git stores everything that makes up your Git project. So as we add new files and create new commits, those are going to end up getting stored in data structures inside of .git. This directory is not something we're going to manage ourselves. We're not going to go inside of there and change or add things. Instead, it is managed by Git, and it gets altered when we run Git commands, which we'll do in just a few moments. Now, you'll notice they're using the term repository. Outside of the context of Git, a repository is defined as a place where things are stored. So a Git repository is nothing more than a place where things related to Git are stored. We're going to see the word repository come up quite a bit. In this case, we have a local repository. It's in a directory, .git, on our machines. As we start to integrate with GitHub and Heroku, we'll have remote repositories where our code is backed up. For example, Heroku needs the code to deploy to the server, and GitHub needs the code so it can actually use it as part of its little software project management platform. Now that we have Git initialized, let's talk about a couple of the other things we're seeing here. In the tree view on the left-hand sidebar, everything in the web server folder just showed up in green. So Visual Studio Code by default has Git support, and when we initialize a project, it shows files in green that have not yet been committed. So these are brand new files which would show up under that untracked files category that we had saw in the previous video. You'll also notice that while a new directory was created, it's not showing up inside of the web server folder where it actually lives. That's because Visual Studio Code hides that directory by default. It's not something we're manually going to change or manage. Now, if you wanted to see what's inside of there, you could. If we go up to Code, Preferences, Settings, we can change a setting to actually see that directory. Let's take a quick moment to get that done. Under Commonly Used, if we scroll down about a dozen or so settings, we're going to see a small list of excluded files and folders, one of them being .git. That's why it's being ignored in the tree view over here. Let's go ahead and change this. Instead of .git with one T, I'll just use .git with two T's. We're going to click OK, and we'll revert that change in just a moment. And when we do, we can see that a Git directory does show up. If we crack that open, we can see there are all sorts of things inside of here. This is what makes up the Git repository, and this is the stuff that we're never going to touch. So let's go ahead and collapse that directory. And we're also going to alter the pattern once again to have just one T. We'll click OK, and that'll make sure that the Git folder is indeed hidden. So that is what git init does. The only thing it does is it creates that new directory .git, and it initializes the project. From here, we can start the process of using the add command and the commit command to actually track things with Git. From here, we can go ahead and run another command from the terminal. This is the git status command. Git status prints the current status of our setup, and this is going to show us output similar to what we saw in the visualization in the last video. If I run it, one of the main categories here is untracked files, and under there, we can see all of the things that make up our project. We haven't created a commit, so nothing is being tracked, and that's why everything shows up under here. We have node modules, we have our two JSON files, we have the public directory, the source directory, and the templates directory. So from here, we could use git add to add things to the staging area and git commit to actually commit them. Before we do though, there is a single folder in our project we don't want Git to track, and that is the node modules directory. When you're using Git and you're using npm, you don't want Git to track the node modules folder, as this is a generated directory. We can always recreate it by running npm install. npm install is going to use the contents of package.json and package lock.json to bring this directory back to its exact state. So Git doesn't need to know what's inside of node modules. What's inside of there is a ton of other files and folders that are already under version control by the project owners. Now, Git gives us a very easy way to ignore things from our setup. We do that by creating a new file in the repository root. For us, that means we create a new file in the web server directory, and we're going to call this .gitignore. And the name is very important. If it's not exactly spelled right, Git's not going to be able to find the file. Now in here, we can simply list out the things we don't want Git to track, and for us, that's going to be node _modules/. Now, when we do this, Git is not going to track that directory. Even if we tried to use git add, we'll see that it won't show up under untracked files. And we can go ahead and rerun git status to prove that. I'm going to run git status once again. Right here, we can see that node modules is nowhere in sight, which is a good thing. And then we have .gitignore, which is showing up because that's a new file we've added. So at this point in time, everything in untracked files are things we actually do want to track. These are the things that make up our application, and we want to keep track of all of these files over time. That means we're ready to create our first commit. You'll notice that up above, node modules is now grayed out. This is Visual Studio Code letting us know that while this thing exists, it has been ignored by version control. We can still open it and look at what's inside. Everything's just shown in a lighter gray to signify that it's ignored. Down below, we can now use git add to add things to that staging area. Right here, that is git add. Now, when we use git add, we have to list out the things that we want to add. In this case, we can list out things we are seeing here in untracked files. I could list out individual files or entire directories. For example, git add followed by source /. When I do that, it's going to add all of the files in the source directory to the staging area, meaning they're ready to be committed. I can run git status to see that. Right here, git status. Under untracked files, you'll notice that the source directory is no longer listed. That's because we've added it to the staging area, so it's showing up above under changes to be committed. Right here, we have all three files that exist in that source folder. Now, we could choose to make a commit with just these files in it, but I do want to track all of the files that we have listed down below as well. Git add gives us a shortcut to add everything. That is git add dot. This is going to add everything to the staging area, which in this case means everything listed right here. So I'll use git add dot, then I'll run git status once again, and we can see that now we have a whole bunch of files listed under changes to be committed. We no longer have that untracked files section because there are no untracked files left. Now that our staging area is set up, we can actually create the commit, and we do that using git commit. That is commit, and we have to provide a message with each commit, describing what exactly changed. Right here, we do that by providing the M flag followed by our message inside of quotes, and for the first commit, something like initial commit or init commit is typically used. As we create other commits, we'll describe exactly what we're doing, like adding new feature to allow people to communicate privately or adding support for image uploading, a nice concise description of what exactly the changes are adding to the project. In this case though, init commit gets the job done for that first commit. I hit enter, and what happens? A new commit has been created. Now right here, when we run that commit command, we get a bunch of output. I can see right away that we have 16 files being changed and all 16 are listed down below. And right here, all of them are being created. For the first time, they're being added to Git. I see create next to all 16. So at this point, we have one commit inside of our Git repository. And you'll notice over here that all of the files are back to their default color because now they are not new untracked files. As we make changes to our application, though, the colors will change once again. For example, in app.js, I had this console.log call, which we had previously used to make sure the file was actually running. I'm going to go ahead and remove that, save the file, and over in the left-hand sidebar, I can now see that all directories up to and including app.js, they're showing up in orange. This means that we have changes to a file that Git is already tracking. So I see that for web server, public.js, and for the modified file itself. So at this point, we now have a single change made to the project, and we could add that to the staging area and create another commit. Now let's go ahead and run git status. Git status is something we're going to run a lot throughout this course so we can make sure that our changes are actually doing what we're expecting them to do. And right here I can see we have just a single category, changes not staged for commit. This is the unstaged changes category from the previous video where we had our visualization. Right here we have one modified file. It is app.js in the public.js directory, which is the exact file we had modified up above in the text editor. Now we can actually add this to the staging area and make the commit. So to add it to the staging area, we'll use git add. I could either list out this individual file or just use git add dot to add everything, which in this case is just our one file. Either way works. From here, I'm going to run git status again before committing just to make sure everything looks right. Under changes to be committed, we have a single modification to a single file, so I'm ready to make that commit. Right here, that's git commit with the M flag to provide our message, and I can use a message like remove unnecessary console.log call. Perfect. Now that we have the message in place, I can hit enter to actually create the commit, and right down below, we get our output. I can see that we had one file changed and we had two deletions. We deleted line 1 and 2. Line 1 had the console.log and line 2 was an empty line between that and what we now have as line 1 up above. So now we have a local Git repository with two commits. One which added everything into the Git repository and another which tracked a change to one of our already tracked files. Now it's time for a quick challenge where you're going to put the Notes app under version control. I have challenge comments sitting right here. As I just mentioned, goal is to put the Notes app under version control. Step 1 is to initialize a new repository, or repo for short, in that project directory in the Notes app folder. Once you have that in place, you do want to tell Git to ignore the node modules directory, since that project also uses modules from NPM and we don't want to track that folder. And last up, you want to commit all files to the repository, creating an initial commit. And to do that, you'll use a combination of git add and git status, and obviously git commit. So take some time to knock that out, put the Notes app under version control, creating a single commit with all of the project files except for what's under node modules, then come back and click play. How'd you do? Let's go ahead and work through this process together. First up, I'm going to close down app.js and I'll temporarily switch from web server over to Notes app, and I'll do the same thing in the terminal down below. cd ... to get out of the web server folder, then / Notes app to go into that directory. From here, I'll use clear to clear the terminal output. Now, the first thing we want to do is initialize a new repository for this project, and we do that by running git init as we did before. This is going to set up a new repository in the Notes app directory, And now we're ready to start the process of actually setting things up the way we want them. The first thing we're going to do is make sure that node modules never finds its way into the repository by setting up the gitignore file. Right here, .git ignore, and then we will set it up with just one entry, node underscore modules /. Now we can see that's been grayed out, which means that that directory and the files inside of it won't get tracked. From here, we can move on to the last step, which is to create our initial commit. I'm going to start by running git status just to make sure everything looks correct. Down below, the only category we have is untracked files, and we have our files under there. We got all 6 of them. From here, we can use git add with dot to add all of those over to the staging area. And after I do that, I will run git status once again to make sure that things look good. Right here, we have all of the things that are going to be committed the next time we create a commit, and this is what we want. We have our files here without node modules, so we can go ahead and wrap up step 3 by running git commit. We'll provide a message, and we can use init commit, which is typically the message used for the first commit. So right here, we're going to create that commit, and we can see that for all 6 files, we have create mode being used, we have 6 files changed, and we have 587 lines being inserted. Now that we have this in place, the Notes app is under version control. If we were to make changes to the application in the future, we would be able to track those changes as well. Now I'm going to run cd ... /web server to switch back to that directory since the challenge is over, and I'll use clear to clear the terminal output, and I'm going to switch from the Notes app folder back over to the web server project. That's where we're going to stop for this video. Now that we have the basics of Git set up, it's time to focus on getting the code on GitHub and Heroku. That's what we're going to start to do in the next video. I'll see you then.